Hello, everyone. My name is Mark with Board Game Revolution, and we have a special design room interview and discussion. I'm going to introduce the guest in a little bit, but one of the things that we do want to point out is on this design room is mechanics, because there's a plethora of them out there, and you have a ton of designers who seem to always make the right choices when it comes to their games, or some where you see a game and you play it and you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't fit. And that's what we're going to talk about with my guest today. But before we get into that, let me just pull up a few things. So I have to announce our sponsor for today. It's Overpowered Playmatch, which goes on to Kickstarter live on March 26th. You can sign up right now for a free playmat. The winner will be announced on launch day. So make sure to check out Board Game Revolution's community for signing up. And that's Overpowered Playmat. So let me get that back out of the way and introduce my guest. My guest actually has a Kickstarter going on right now, and he has been doing a phenomenal job since his very first campaign, which was a year ago. You guys may have heard of it. It's called Feudum by Mark Swanson. Mark, how you doing?
Pretty good, Marco. How are you doing?
I'm doing very, very well. So today we're going to talk about mechanics, something I know within your game has probably been one of the most talked about and torn things about it. So I thought, you would be the best person to actually come up and discuss about mechanics, how they are implemented, and how you choose the right ones. So first off, what we're going to talk about is Rudders and Ramparts, which is on Kickstarter now. Tell us all about your new Kickstarter.
Sure. Well, Rudders and Ramparts, 3 days left, by the way, is an artisan edition set of vessels and castles that you get that offer a combat variant to the game of Feudum, in a nutshell.
In a nutshell. And you heard them, guys. You have 3 days left. So mechanics, Mark, for you, what does mechanics mean? Like, I know this is probably something that is a loose term that people have been using about mechanics, and they'll say words with it. It's like fiddly or simple, complete.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to you, what is a mechanic?
Well, they're the building blocks, really, of the game. They're the actions within a game that advance the game along, and they allow players to interact both directly and indirectly. So they're pretty important, and there are a lot of them out there. Some of the more common, I like to say, the Euro style mechanics are worker placement. That's one of my favorite. In fact, my next game is going to be focused on worker placement. But Uwe Rosenberg's Agricola, Le Havre, Caverna, or Lords of Waterdeep is worker placement. Russian Railroads, another fun game, is worker placement. Area control. One of the first area control games I played was El Grande way back when. Where it matters where pieces are on the board. Auctions and bidding. Where something, a resource or some artifact goes up for auction, and you have to bid on it. And the game that comes to mind is Princes of Florence. You have deck building like Dominion. Everyone plays Dominion. Trading, probably the gateway game that is this kind of stepping stone into the hobby for a lot of people, is Settlers of Catan. That involves trading. But some mechanics are simple, and some are a little more complex.
Right, and like there are mechanics, because a lot of the ones you mentioned are well known out there, but you can also think that turn taking is basically a mechanic, because you have some games, there are games where it's simultaneous gameplay. There is no turns. And then you have ones that are turn-based.
Yeah.
And that's a mechanic. Or a simple one that I like to use is draw then play, or play then draw.
Right.
Those are both simple mechanics that actually add more to the game.
I agree. Board Game Geek does a great job of kind of breaking down all the mechanics. If you go to the site and you click on mechanics, you can kind of get a sense of what they all are. Some are simple, like I would say, dice rolling, right? Quarriors, which is a fun game, or Adventures of Marco Polo, which is kind of like rolling dice but with a twist. You have area or point-to-point movement, where you're just simply taking your pawn and you're moving them by way of the dice or by way of a certain number of action point allotment. And then you have probably the most fundamental or basic kind of mechanic is rock paper scissors, where one thing trumps another thing, and that thing trumps the first thing. But those are the simple ones. The more complex ones, in my opinion, are variable player powers. There's a game I'm sure everyone knows about. In fact, their Kickstarter is going on right now, called Root, where you have asymmetrical player powers. Every character does something a little different. You have action point allowance, where on your turn you're given so many actions that you're allowed to use. There's a board game, one of the first board games I played way back when, is a game called Java, and you were allowed 6 action points per turn. Then you have action programming, which is one of my favorite, like in Feudum, or variable phase order, which is Puerto Rico. Andrew Safar's Puerto Rico is a fantastic game.
Right, and so with all these, available to designers, how is it when you start game design that you pick that one main one that you then have supplementary mechanics around it? Like, what does it take to actually go, okay, this is how I want to start the egg before I start creating all around?
I think designers start out with kind of a central mechanic that they have in mind. It's kind of the main game engine, if you will, that's going to facilitate the action in their game. And then from there, they kind of move forward. Once you kind of have the main engine, then you add like additional cogs to that engine to kind of add some complexity to the game. And this kind of mixing of mechanics really is what gives a game its unique flavor. For instance, one of my, I'm citing a lot of these classic games. Princess of Florence, right, is kind of a fun mix of both tile placement, where you're almost like Tetris, you're positioning the tiles on your board, but then auction bidding is a huge mechanic in that game. Or in the case of another one of my favorite games, Goa, you have auction bidding, but you also have kind of a hand management in the game, and also this kind of press your luck mechanic, where in that game you're drawing colonists or hoping to draw lots of colonists. So yeah, it's the mix of mechanic that gives the game their flavor.
Right, and not only that, something that's more common in recent years is the micro turn, where it used to be all about, everybody has their own individual turns, and whether it's perfect information or incomplete information, it was dependent on how much you really had to pay attention. Like in some cases, with perfect information, you're having to watch everything that's out there to then come up with your move. But when it's incomplete, you just basically do your move and then wait.
Right, and a lot of people would call that kind of a solitaire game, where there's a low degree of player interaction. But I think the games that are more stimulating, you have to pay attention on other people's turns.
Right, and so I think that shift of what has now become more well known, the micro action, has really garnished that very well.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Because now players are constantly having to watch and interact, because it was before the player in front of you was your direct interaction, and who played right before you, and you were the players after you, their direct interaction. Now it's with these 10-second turns, everyone's pretty much a player interaction for everybody else.
Yeah, I agree.
So with that, my next question is then, when it comes to, like, Feudum has a very heavy theme, and there is this whole talk about theme, mechanic, and what comes first.
Yes. So
first off, we're going to talk about, from you, what came first, the theme or mechanic, or vice versa, or was it simultaneous?
Right, that's a great question. I think that it varies from designer to designer. And I'll tell you about Feudum in a minute, but during the kind of the Eurogame explosion, there were a lot of German board game designers, like Rainer Knizia, for instance, who invented games like Modern Art and Tigris and Euphrates and Ra. But he was also a mathematician. And you can kind of see that in his work. Or Richard Garfield, who invented Magic the Gathering, right? He's a mathematician. And so chances are that the more math-minded types probably start out with the mechanic and then lay a theme on top of it. And others like me, I'm a little more visually oriented. And so I kind of start out with a theme and then slowly integrate the mechanic into it. And there's really not a right or wrong way of doing it, in my opinion. Although if you're not careful, there can be, some kind of mechanic mismatches, if you will.
Right, and we'll get into mechanic mismatches right after we fulfill this question, because that's a huge thing I think people don't really know about, and how it could really do a detriment to a game by having these mismatches. Yeah. But what I want to know is then, does the theme affect the mechanic? As you're building that theme that you are creating this world, does the mechanic change, or sometimes goes to a completely different mechanic?
Sure, that's a great question. I think that one is definitely affected by the other. I mean, one piece of advice I got when I was creating the mechanics for Feudum was to make sure that I incentivized the players of the game with the thing that I wanted them to do. So if there's no reward for something in the game, then no one's going to do it. And the theme of the game is not going to be advanced, right? So I wanted people, for instance, in Feudum, to be able to play their dutiful role in this economic ecosystem. And so I made sure that I gave them enough points for doing that. Otherwise, the entire economy of the game would stall.
Right. And which I guess then leads to, if you didn't do that, then it led to the theme mechanic mismatch.
Right.
So what is theme mechanic mismatch, in your opinion,
Sure.
And how does it affect games?
Yeah, well, like you said, some games are kind of criticized for having a theme that doesn't quite fit with the gameplay, and in some cases, those games will ultimately either fall by the wayside or get a theme overhaul. I don't want to pick on any games in particular. I don't think that would be very nice, but some games are good to start out with, and then maybe even get better, or they change in their flavor. Like I love the game Wallenstein, but that was re-released as Shogun, which is a completely different theme and a completely different feel. And other games, just get kind of a theme update, like people that play Settlers Catan that got bored with the theme. Well, now you can play Star Trek Catan, right? But the key is the mechanics should feel like the theme. And every designer does something different with that truth. Like one game in particular, it's been said to be kind of an all-out war game where you are ruthlessly battling opposing factions, right? You think that might be a World War II game or something, but in this particular game, the warring factions happen to be these cute little woodland creatures, and that game is called Root.
I actually was just gonna say that. It's like, that is exactly Root. But some people, I mean, there has been quite a following. I mean, have you seen how his expansion doing? I think they broke $1 million.
Yeah.
And even though it was a mismatch, it worked for them.
So, I agree. And so it may not be a mismatch. It may be just that people are okay with laying on particular themes because they are enamored by that particular theme. But like you said, there are definitely some mismatches where you're like, am I really navigating this steamship down the Mississippi River? Am I really trying to take, do 14th century farming? Am I really trying to power this particular city based on the mechanics that are happening?
Right. Now, I have a comment here that I'm going to read from Dave Gray. He says, mechanics should make sense from a theme perspective. Otherwise, it fails to make sense to a player.
Right.
I can definitely agree with that statement. But on the other side of it is, like you said, Root, it kind of feels more casual and it opens it up to other players. So there's kind of a fine line that you have to consider when you are picking your theme or the mechanics for it. Because I know of another one, I'm not going to name their name, but I think the reason why it failed was because of a theme mechanic mismatch. The theme was very light, but the gameplay was extremely heavy.
You know what? In the case of Feudum, there were a couple of cases where I needed the players to perform a very specific thing in the game and during development. And oftentimes I'd say, well, why am I doing that? What's the flavor of that particular action as it relates to the theme? And at the time, well, I didn't really tie that particular action with the theme. So I had to make sure it was tied to a theme. And once I did, then suddenly the players would nod their head and say, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. And part of that is helping people understand the mechanics of the game as well, and remember the mechanics of the game.
Right, and I think that's one of the things that I've read probably most about your game is remembering all the nuances to what happens. Like
Right.
if you attack this player and you use your salt for it that comes in from your wine, adds a defense here or adds a bonus to the attack. But then you also have to remember about the guild that's going on to the left side of the board.
Right, right. And the people that have invested in the narrative of the game, it simply have to recall the narrative and then can understand some of those outlier rules a lot easier.
Right. And here's Dave has another comment. He says, and I think this is a great compliment to you. He says, Feudum forces you to perform actions that make sense in order to progress the gameplay. Otherwise, it would just stall.
No, thank you.
Okay. And I think your epoch timer is another good little supplementary mechanic. As you're removing those little tiles, the epoch tiles on the bottom, it's progressing
Right.
the game along.
Right.
So everything you're doing is moving the game forward.
Right. And every game has, those kind of end game conditions. In the case of Puerto Rico, for instance, there are 3 ways that can trigger the end of that game. You don't have any colonists left, you don't have any victory points left, or you have all of your building, one player has all of their building spaces filled up. And so I think that's very important, that there is definitely a definitive end to every game.
But can it ever be too much? I mean, that would be just playing devil's advocate here. Could it be too much that there's too many endgame conditions where it feels abrupt?
There could be. I mean, some mechanic criticisms include games that just have too many ways to score points. That's called point salad, and you probably want to try to avoid that. Other games have too many exceptions to the rules, right? Some games are kind of criticized as being quote unquote Ameritrash games because there are too many exceptions to rules and too many outlier cases. So yeah, there's definitely pitfalls to avoid.
Right. And like for me, I'm just gonna say from my experience, like some of my favorite games are ones that have single end conditions, and the biggest one I'm gonna say that people on their mind is Brass Birmingham. The game is gonna end once your hand runs out, so you have a timer that is physically seen. And for me, I kind of like that because it helps me strategize better. But you're right, like in Puerto Rico, though, you have to pay closer attention.
Right. And some people like that. Some people like that extra layer of, oh, wait, there's different ways that the end game could be triggered, because it just might stimulate your brain a little more.
Right. So continuing on with that, hold on, my questions just closed on me. How much has Feudum changed from your initial mechanic to what it is today?
Yeah. The initial mechanic has always been action programming. A long time ago, there was a game called Maharaja that I loved to play, and the main mechanic was action programming, and so that was a big part of it. Now, there were lots of little smaller mechanics that I added to the game, but once I chose that one, it pretty much stuck. So yeah, It's pretty much the same mechanic that I had now. Everything surrounding that mechanic, evolved and got polished, but that main mechanic stuck.
And how did you really? Because you said that it all evolved. How did you choose your supplementary mechanics, such as the dice roll after everybody's taken their selections, or the guilds? Actually, the asymmetrical guilds. That's something that supplements the game and adds more depth to it. Like, how did you really come up with a good sense that we're going to make this and make it short and balanced?
Sure,
because that's
sure.
a huge issue that can come with game design is balancing.
I mean, I play tested the game many, many times with many, many different groups. Number one, number two, I collected data. I did data analysis. I kept track of every action performed in a game to see how often it was performed, to make sure that there were certain things that weren't getting left out. And then I would make minute point adjustments. Like one mistake that game designers make is they want this action over here to be performed more often, so they assign more points associated to that action, but they over reward it, and then that throws off the balance in the game. And it really is like a scale. So if you're going to make a point adjustment, make it minute, make it like 1 point, and then see what happens and test it. Now that's kind of laborious, but it's important.
But they also have to remember, even these minute ones can break a game. I think the Sadler brothers were telling me during playtesting that any type of little small change sometimes could just wreck it out of nowhere.
That's true. I remember back in 2014 when I was at Gen Con, I was worried that I might be at a disadvantage for not being a mathematician, and I went to this panel that included designers on it like Eric Lang, who made Rising Sun, and the card game, A Game of Thrones, and other games. Bruno Feduti, who's known for Citadels, Mike Elliott for Couriers. And I asked them, I had my hand held up pretty much the whole time. They kept calling on me. And I said, do I need to hire a math professor to reverse engineer my game to make sure that everything is balanced correctly? And to my surprise, they said, no. And I said, why not? And they offered a couple of reasons. They said that by thoroughly play testing the game, you will discover little broken elements and pitfalls and holes. And if you just make minor adjustments as you go and you continue to play test, then the game will start to the math in the game will start to kind of present itself. Then they also said that every Euro and most games have kind of this self-correcting mechanism where people happen to target the leader as well. So the rest of the people in the game are always kind of like reeling in the leader, and that helps balance the game as well, if everything else fails.
Right. Well, I'm glad you said that, and gave us that story, because that was going to be my next question was, do you have to be a mathematician? So yeah, no, you don't, which is great, and it makes it a little less daunting to go into design for the newcomers that really want to start, making their dreams come true.
It's very true, yes.
All right. So Dave made a comment here, and I actually want to expand on it. Dave said, Feudum feels very polished. And that comes into one of the things that we were just talking about was breaking a game. There has been games that have been published out there, and I'm even going to say by bigger name companies, that they miss breaks in the mechanics.
Sure.
So was it just the playtesting, or what was it to get your game to feel as polished as it was mechanically?
Great question. Well, first of all, yes, play testing. You can never play test enough. But the problem is that no matter how many friends you have, or how many groups, or how many unpub events you go to, you will never play test the game enough to truly know whether or not it's broken. Because the only time that your game can be play tested by thousands and tens of thousands of people is after it's released. And that's when you truly find out whether or not it's broken. Like take Andrew Safar's Puerto Rico, for instance. Here's a game that was a number one on Board Game Geek for I don't know how long, 5 years in a row or something, and uh, it was just kind of like the gamer's game, and everyone played it, and there were tournaments about it, and then eventually someone or a group of people reverse engineered the game and discovered mathematically that there were certain buildings that if you selected those buildings, you had a statistically higher percentage chance of winning. And the word got out, and players decided or found out what those buildings were, and then why wouldn't you play those or go after those buildings in a tournament, right? And so the designer found out about this, and he had to make a revision. And I don't think that there's any shame in a designer saying, "All right, I'm going to update the rule there to make the game a little bit better." At South by Southwest in Austin just last week, I happened to go to dinner with Patrick Leader, and he, as you know, is on the team that made Root, and he told me that he had come up with the Lizard Cult faction in that game, and he liked to ask people about it. What do you think about it? Are you playing it? Do you ever win with it? And after a while, he got feedback to the point where he said to himself, "You know what? I'm going to tweak that in the next iteration of the rules." And there's no shame in that. It's almost impossible to perfectly playtest a game before it's released.
Right. I feel like it needs and have the availability to basically go through double blind test.
Right.
Because, not everybody's going to be truthful in front of you. When you say, "Hey, I have a game, playtest it." You will have those who give you very valid, advice and criticism, or be like, "Yeah, I've really enjoyed it." But there are those who feel kind of meek because you're standing there, in front of them, getting the information that they don't want to tell you their true thoughts. And so, I think it was the Sadler brothers who said they basically do it online through Tabletopia, where they put it out there and they are not sitting in front of the testers. They hire them all, they fill out sheets, and then they get sent. So would you think that might be a avenue for game developers to go to start doing, or is there another way?
Absolutely. I mean, it takes a little while for Tabletopia or Tabletop Simulator to take your assets and create the game in an online environment. But definitely a lot of designers will do that and then gain and gather feedback from the playtesting that happens out there online. That's definitely one way. The Board Game Geek forums are another way. People will just give you feedback, or the Board Game Designers Forum on Board Game Geek is a great way to let more than just your immediate playtesting group try to break your game. And that should be the goal. You want to tell people, break this game. Go off and do this strange little thing in the corner that no one would ever, in the right mind ever try, and see if it throws off the game.
Right. And Richard just said, video game industry has access to much more data as the board game industry, and still buff nerf are an inherent part of the competitive scene.
Right. I mean, you only need to look on Facebook to find all of those wonderful, weird things that happen on Red Dead Redemption 2, right? A masterful game that won awards at South by Southwest. But even that game's got a bug here or two. Yeah.
Right. And Jason says he loves your unique art for Feudum.
Thank you.
So we're gonna go off that. So how about art?
By the way, on that, I've always loved expressionism as an art movement with its thick black lines and etchings and muted color schemes. There's a French expressionist painter named Bernard Buffet in particular that I really love. And that's probably why also I like Alexander Roche's game. He was the artist for the game Trois, or if you're not French, Troyes. and of course why I like my artist Justin Schultz, who really loves the etching look and muted color schemes.
So that actually brings up an interesting question. Does art affect mechanics, or can it? And hold on, everybody. Did you hear me, Mark?
I can hear you now.
All right. My question was, can art affect mechanics, and vice versa?
Okay, now I can hear you.
All right. One more time. Can art affect mechanics and vice versa? Have you ever felt that?
That's a good question. I haven't thought of that one. Can art affect the mechanics? I think the theme can affect the mechanics in so much as art is. Then I would say yes. Yeah, I would say art/theme for sure.
Right. The reason I asked that is because, like you were saying, and if you actually look at your artwork, it enhances the mechanic that you're trying to portray.
But keep in mind, though, that if as a designer, if I'm dead set on one thing happening in the game a certain way, and the art doesn't facilitate that thing happening, then I tell the artist, you need to change the art. I don't think I've ever been in a situation where the art has been already drawn, and then I think, oh, well, I'm going to change the mechanic because of the way that art was drawn. I think you can't be influenced that much by the art first. You have to think about mechanics on a fundamental level and make sure the art facilitates those mechanics.
Right. The reason I asked that is another example. I guess a game I can't name that's out there that unfortunately its artwork was not fitting the mechanics in all essence. And instead of taking art back to the drawing board, they moved forward with it. And it ended up failing twice, on Kickstarter, and they keep on asking why. And I think no one's really open enough to say, theme, mechanic, mismatch, art is just not working for you, and It's not drawing me to your game. But at the same time, you can make the secondary argument with Euro games where it's not about theme. Like if you played Food Chain Magnet, there is no artwork or theme in there, but that is a very sought out game.
Right. That's a good point. Yes, some games are very abstract and the art is somewhat incidental.
Right. All right. So if you guys have any questions, we'll give this last little bit of time with you and Mark. Dave had to run off, but he wanted to leave you a remark. Mark, he said he wanted to thank you for making such a wonderful game and being such a fantastically nice guy. He's backing Rudders and can't wait. Congrats. And he hopes this isn't your last.
Thank you. It's not. I'm actually working on one right now.
Great. When can we expect that?
Oh, you're going to jinx it for me. I'm a professor, so I'm taking 3 months off this summer, and I'm going to be focused on the game. I'm going to lock myself in a cabin and work on it. So.
All right. Actually, Jason wanted to add on to art. He says he always felt like the art helps tell the untold story and feeling of the game. So if the mechanic is to get you through it, the art is basically the enhancement that tells it, and how you're doing it.
That's very true. I remember when I was playing Euro games in the early '90s. I quickly became a fan of legends like Reiner Knizia and Klaus Teuber, Martin Wallace, Andrew Seyfarth, but I kept looking for kind of the holy grail of game, which combined the mechanics, combined the art, and one thing that I loved that we didn't talk about was trying to find a unique mechanic that makes your game unique. I think every designer needs to think about that. For me, it was a game that would have kind of this open world feeling to it, a sandbox game, as some people call it, where you could kind of eke out your medieval existence in the case of Feudum, but one that featured a really, truly working economy, a cyclical economy, and I couldn't find that. So I invented it, and there are lots of games out there that I would say, oh, well, that game feels different because it has a unique mechanic, like Traders of Genoa, again, kind of a classic game, had that unique tower mechanic where you would move that stack throughout the marketplace, or Wallenstein had that cool cube tower, where you throw the cubes into the tower to define the battle. Or even Trajan by Stefan Feld had that cool rondel system, or even a more modern game like Zulkin,
Hmm.
that has that rotating Mayan calendar. I mean, if a designer can come up with something that's unique and then also pair it with some fundamental existing mechanics that exist, I think they're onto something.
Right, like to go on anachrony. It's travel back to borrow from time. So you're not stuck with only the resources you have. Was a really cool and interesting mechanic that you never really saw before. That
Right.
was only opened after a certain level.
Sure, sure. It's like going back to the draw pile.
Exactly, which is kind of borrowed, and I think a lot of the new mechanics that are coming today are borrowing from the past. And
Or kind of like kind of borrowed, but also kind of fresh,
right.
right? Uh,
And I think some of the newer game designers are not going back to far enough back to game development and the 80s 90s of board games, where you really had a huge load of people going into game theory and putting that into the games. And I think that would really help add more value and substance.
I really agree with that. I think that the more you can immerse yourself in the hobby and play a lot of the classics, not just the new ones coming out, but a lot of the classic games, the more of the neural pathways are going to be opened up in your mind, and the more you'll be inspired. And you can only do that by playing lots of games.
Right. Like a perfect example is, and it's going to be hard to find, is Vici, which is actually a port. It's Small World. Vici was turned into Small World, but
Mhm.
with its changes and a lot of streamlining of the game. But if you have a chance and if you can find it, at one of the conventions, I say give Vici a try. While
Right.
it's rough, it really kind of revolutionized some of the mechanics that are used today.
Yeah, I think I've heard a lot of people criticize modern designers for simply recycling old mechanics, and that might be a warranted criticism, but I think that a lot of times a designer respects some of these fundamental mechanics of the people that came before us, the kind of the legends of the hobby. And it reminds me of how painters in the Renaissance would make exact replicas or copies of more established painters as a way of learning how to paint. And once they learned, then they deviated and came up with their own unique style. Like, Picasso was a cubist painter, but before that, he made exact, realistic copies of former painters.
Right.
So I think you have to kind of appreciate and embrace uh, the legendary game designers and the fundamental mechanics before you can deviate.
Right. Because there are just those that don't appreciate where it came from.
Yeah,
And you're right. Have more of appreciation before you say, "Oh, I've created a new mechanic," when really it's not.
right.
It's something that's been there, and you probably did not do it justice.
Right.
Anyway, well, Mark, this has been a great conversation that we've had. So, what would you leave off new game designers when it comes to mechanics?
What advice would I give them?
Yep.
Play lots of games and play test and try to come up with something unique, something that you could call your own. Um, and don't neglect art. Art is so important to even inspire playtesters to want to even play your game. I mean, it's great if you can concept. It's great if you can play a game on white cardboard that you've sketched out the design and all of that. But take it to the next level and be mindful of the art so that you inspire playtesters to interact and go deep into the mechanics of your game to get the most feedback.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. This has been phenomenal. And we'll have this up on YouTube in a few days. If you guys want to go back and pull the information that Mark has given us, to help new designers learn about mechanics and about the mismatches that can happen, make sure to check us out. If you guys have any questions, you can always ask Mark on our channel here, and I'm sure we'll get the questions over to him. Don't forget, Feudum, Rudders, and Ramparts has 3 days left. Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you, Marco, and thanks to Board Game Revolution.
Of course, thank you. All right, guys, hold on. All right, guys, my name is Mark with Board Game Revolution. This segment has been brought to you by Overpowered Playmats and Feudum. Guys, make sure to check them out. If you have other samples you want to take a look at of our information given, we have playtesting by the Sadler Brothers. We talk about distribution with Shem Phillips, and we also talk about art with Todd Allspec of Suburbia. And that's all on our YouTube channel. Guys, thank you for joining us. Have a great night.